Okay. Well, welcome everyone to this latest installment of the Suicide Justice series, a salon series initiated by the Critical Health and Social Action Lab at the Ontario Institute for Studies and Education at the University of Toronto. We are a lab that supports community-engaged research for health justice, working with First Nations, Inuit, and Métis communities across Canada and around the world. We initiated this series now sometime almost a year ago was when we started it and started planning it to really create a wide-reaching digital context for broad engagement on the intersections of suicide research and research surrounding varying forms of complex death and dying to really presence conversations of intersections that concern social justice. We're really inspired by the article Suicide Justice and Cardin's work on really bringing to bear feminist, queer, disability justice, among other interlocking critiques that are
Is it just me or Jeffrey seems frozen? Okay.
in
Oh,
our society. And um, apparently my internet connection is unstable. So I'm going to just take a breath. Among the many things today, technology is not being friendly to me. Uh, but I digress. We've been really delighted in this series to welcome a wide range of folks who are doing scholarship that takes very seriously the contributions of feminist, queer, crip, disability justice, Marxist, anarchist, um, Black and Indigenous scholarship around and among other traditions around suicide. And it's really my delight today to welcome Professor Alexandre Baril to share with us today. Um, Professor Baril is an associate professor at the University of Toronto. His work is incredible, I would argue, and I have recently argued in a review of his most recent book that he's written one of the most foundational and significant texts to really reshape the work and theorization around suicide in probably a century. And it's truly an honor to have you join us today, Alexandra. And I know that you'll bring with you generous invitations to think differently, powerfully, critically, and more than anything, ethically about what it means to, yeah, respond to a world where suicide exists, and the many claims which it demands us to attend to. So, with that, I'll welcome you to begin your conversation today. I'm grateful for your presence here and looking forward to taking this hour with you.
thank you so much for the introduction. And I invite you to come see the rest of the series. They are incredible speakers every month speaking in that series, like seriously, like among the best scholars in critical suicidology. So it's really important to come. I will share my screen. Please let me know if you can see it. Is that good? Thumbs up, everyone? Perfect. Great, and I will start my timer. I want to thank you, all of you being here. It's good to see some faces also when we present. So thank you for having your camera on. It will be great during conversation. All the images in my presentations are paintings, finger paintings by Paulo Troilo. And you might hear it in my voice. I'm quite sick. I'm recovering of a very bad case of COVID, and I'm still sick. And I also injured my back. I'm taking strong medication, and I'm quite foggy. And English is my second language, so just bear with me today. I'll do my best to present. So My presentation is drawn from several arguments presented in my book. As Jeffrey mentioned, it's called Undoing Suicidism. You have it on the screen. And for those of you interested, it's freely available on my publisher's website in open access. There's also multiple articles published in recent years, all freely available on my academia page, some of them in French for those of you who are Francophone or Francophiles. So there you go. I would like to emphasize that while my approach to suicide and assisted suicide is radically different from those currently known, it's not intended to encourage suicide. On the contrary, I hope that my approach will help reduce suicidality. And I also want to warn you that this presentation will deal with very sensitive topics, and this may trigger strong emotions for some people. To this end, I have included crisis and hotline numbers you can see on this slide, so I invite you to take a picture or a screen capture if needed. And before starting, I want to specify that my use of the broader term suicidality refers to three things. First, suicidal ideations. Second, suicide attempts. And third, completed suicide. So I would like to start this presentation with a bold statement that I will unpack in the rest of my presentation. So we fail to prevent suicide 100% of the time in the case of completed suicides. While we might be tempted from a savior perspectives to congratulate ourselves and think that we do everything we can to prevent suicides, and that it seems to be working with some people who contact suicide prevention services, the radical truth is that every single completed suicide is the proof that what we are doing currently is not working and is not effective, because each of those people did not call for help in the few days, hours, or minutes before completing their suicide. Think about it, every single one of them, because they knew that calling for help would scuttle their plan and would involve harm and negative consequences. So they decided to complete their suicide alone and without any process of accompaniment. Even when people are institutionalized and incarcerated and under high surveillance, we cannot prevent their suicide every time. So the fact that suicidal people are left to fend for themselves and die alone in atrocious conditions is what pushed me almost 10 years ago now to start advocating for a harm reduction approach regarding suicide. And in this presentation, I'll explain how I arrive at that conclusion and how a queercrip harm reduction approach on suicide might be one key response to suicidality and suicidal people from a social justice perspective. So there have been more fundings dedicated to suicide prevention, public discussions on mental health issues, and campaigns inviting suicidal people to reach out to hotlines and counseling services to discuss their suicidality. At the same time, however, talking about suicide, specifically your potential suicide as a suicidal person, remains taboo. Leah Lakshmi Piepsna Samarasina, a queer, non-binary femme and disabled person of color who is an artist, writer, and educator on disability justice, demonstrates how suicidality remains taboo even in anti-oppression circles such as anti-racist, queer, trans, and disabled circles. Piepsna Samarasina says, and I quote here, "If anyone came at me saying, 'Have you thought about killing yourself lately?' I'd automatically lie and say, 'Hell no,' the way I have to every single doctor, social worker, and most therapists in my life. Like any smart crazy, I don't want anything I can prevent on my permanent record, and I definitely don't want danger to self or others. I've been fighting this my whole life, and I've seen the oppression and hardness that label can mean to folks. But if you normalize it, because it's normal, this secret that so many of us wrestle with suicidality, then just maybe, I'll tell you where I was at. So Piepsna Samarasina identifies forms of ableism, insanism, the discrimination against people considered insane and living with mental health issues, as key barriers preventing honest conversations about suicidality, not only in suicide prevention services, but also within anti-oppression milieus. So while suicidality impacts all individuals and communities, research shows that social determinants of health and power relations between privileged groups and marginalized communities influence the prevalence of suicidality. For example, Jeffrey Ansloss and Shanna Pelletier indicate that suicide rates for Indigenous youth are tremendously higher than in the rest of the population. And I will not read here this quote that is from a report for Statistics Canada, but what's important to say is that some recent studies shows that Inuit people in Canada experience suicide rate 6 to 25 times the national rates. And staggering numbers about suicidality can also be found in sexual and gender minorities. While rates of suicidality among lesbian, gay, bisexual, and queer people are quite high compared to their heterosexual counterparts, statistics comparing cisgender people that are non-trans people and trans individuals are even more striking. So a 2016 study, you can see it on the screen, of more than 27,000 trans people in the US shows that, quote, 40% have attempted suicide in their lifetime and 7% attempted suicide in the past year, nearly 12 times the rate in the US population, end of quote. And these American statistics, unfortunately, are quite representative of those on 2S LGBTQIA plus populations in other geographical contexts. There are even some studies in Australia that indicate that suicidality rates are up to 20 times higher for trans communities. So while the support needs of marginalized people experiencing distress are important, they remain, as is also generally the case for suicidal people, unmet through current suicide prevention services. As I have shown in my work, the majority of current prevention services fail to reach suicidal people. And this failure is especially salient when it comes to the people who are the most determined to die or who belong to marginalized groups. For example, Cordes Wright, a self-identified Black, fat, non-binary queer femme, discusses in their blog how quickly suicidal people learn to lie and remain silent about their suicidal ideations to avoid negative consequences, particularly when they belong to marginalized communities. And Wright says, and I quote here, "I call the suicide prevention hotline, not quite realizing that sometimes suicide prevention looks like emergency vehicles and mandatory hospital stays, when all you want, all you need is to talk." Making mostly false promises of personal safety, I ended up the phone call and learned to shut up about wanting to die. And unfortunately, this type of testimony is supported by a great deal of research demonstrating that suicidal people, particularly those from marginalized groups and those determined to die, do not feel safe at all to ask for help. In her interviews with 100 suicidal individuals, Susan Stephen concludes that they do not discuss their wish to die when they want to achieve their goal. And I quote here Susan Stephen saying, "Many people who kill themselves often plan their suicide carefully and conceal those plans with great success from the people who know them best, including friends and family. The people I interviewed were unanimous in saying that the more determined they were to kill themselves, the more they concealed their intentions from the people in their lives. And I argue that this silencing effect also applies to healthcare, social services, and suicide prevention services. Suicidal people remain silent, feel it's not safe to share their distress. And as empirical research shows, suicidal people, like those considered mad or crazy, are institutionalized, incarcerated, and drugged against their will, excluded from entrance program, not hired for new jobs, fired from their current ones, having their parental rights revoked, and are subjugated to other unfair treatments. The horrific experiences that some people go through as a result of disclosing their suicidal ideations are so difficult that many say, as is the case in a Rodente and colleagues study of trans suicidal people, that they would prefer to die than to seek help and deal with the negative consequences. Among the factors that prevent marginalized people from seeking help are the fact that the services offered often increase forms of structural violence experienced by suicidal individuals, such as those founded on racism, colonialism, ageism, ableism, saneism, sexism, heterosexism, or cisgenderism. In that sense, I argue that suicide prevention services do more harm than good. And in particular, I draw on some evidence as reported by transformative justice collectives, such as Trans Lifeline. There's also Blackline in the US that have similar arguments. So Trans Lifeline, for those of you who don't know it, it's a hotline dedicated to trans and non-binary people in distress in the US and in Canada that demonstrates how trans people experience particular forms of violence that are exacerbated by the use of these services. Trans Lifeline refuses to call emergency services such as 911 or the police, even when someone is actively suicidal and want to complete their suicide, unless the person say, yes, I consent to that intervention. So here I quote Trans Lifeline. They say, we surveyed about 800 trans people across the US regarding their experiences with suicide hotline use. Approximately 70% stated that they had never called a suicide hotline, but over half of those specified that they had been in crisis, but did not feel safe calling a hotline. Approximately a quarter stated that they had interacted with law enforcement or emergency personnel as a result of a crisis call, while 1 in 5 had been placed on an involuntary psychiatric hold. So, Trans Lifeline argues that non-consensual rescue intensifies suicidality due to the inhuman, harmful, violent treatment imposed on suicidal trans subjects by the police and healthcare providers. So following some of their observations, I identified a series of negative consequences associated with non-consensual rescues that affect various marginalized groups differently, such as trans communities. But we can do the exercise for many other different marginalized groups. And here I summarize these negative impacts in 5 points for the trans communities. First, those rescues often out trans people to their relatives and families, and such forms of outing can lead to further rejection, expulsion from the home, and violence. Second, those rescues involve fees, ambulance, hospitalization, and so on, for trans people who are already overrepresented on statistics on poverty. Third, involuntary hospitalization and histories of mental health issues, particularly suicidality, may negatively impact access to trans affirmative healthcare by delaying or literally blocking care. Fourth, That's proven everywhere. Interactions with the healthcare system and social services often include stigmatization and violence. And fifth, those rescues break the trust of potential hotline callers who may fear that the operators will initiate a non-consensual active rescue. So in other words, a hotline that supports coercive suicide prevention measures, which is the case with 99.9% of hotline and crisis line in North America, does not elicit trust, confidence, or honest sharing by suicidal people. In sum, rather than finding the comfort, support, care, and listening they are looking for, a majority of marginalized people, as we just saw with the example of trans people, experience abuse, discrimination, microaggressions, trauma, and forms of incarceration as a result of reaching out for help, which seems counterproductive and simply unacceptable. To date, scholarship has emphasized a range of solutions to reach marginalized suicidal people, such as peer support community services, cultural competent prevention services, and of course, social, political, legal battles to improve the lives of marginalized communities in order to reduce their suicidality, often using an intersectional approaches. While I support these initiatives that do extraordinary work addressing structural violence that increase suicidality among marginalized groups, it's important to note that in these structural and intersectional analysis, one dimension that of suicidality is missing. Among the 2,000 references I consulted for my book, I did not come across any that dealt with suicidality as an oppression. It's starting now with fabulous scholars. I saw that Loretta Lemaster is connected today. So this is a person that have argued similar argument to me. Just want to highlight their work. So among all those references, I didn't see one that deal with suicidality as an oppression, yet suicidal people experience a specific oppression that is interlocked with other oppressions, and that should be, of course, be discussed when it comes to suicidality. And this literature is not the only one that does not theorize the oppression of suicidal people. It's such a forgotten experience that before I named this oppression and coined the term suicidism, no one had talked about it in those terms. Yet, the media is replete with horrific stories of suicidal individuals facing inhuman treatment after expressing their suicidal ideations, being hospitalized, drugged against their will, handcuffed, shot by police, a phenomenon that is very linked to colonialism and racism, to losing their job, to even being kicked off campuses, such as this University of Toronto student a few years ago. So these stories illustrate that. I will skip, just to keep the time, I will skip that one. So the thesis I put forth is that suicidal people are oppressed by structural suicidism. So borrowing from other terms such as sexism or racism, I coined the neologism suicidism in 2016. And here is a definition. So suicidism refers to a system functioning at the normative, discursive, medical, legal, social, political, economic, and epistemic levels, a system in which suicidal people experience multiple forms of injustice and violence, such as discrimination, stigmatization, exclusion, pathologization, criminalization, etc. Inspired by the notion of compulsory heterosexuality and the notion of compulsory able-bodiedness and able-mindedness, theorizing disability and CRIP and MAD studies, the theoretical framework on suicidism I propose allows for a rethinking of what I call compulsory aliveness. I argue that compulsory aliveness represents the normative component of suicidism and includes various injunctions or moral imperatives, including what I've called the injunction to live and to futurity. Suicidism and compulsory aliveness are also linked to many other oppressions, including ableism and saneism. I contend that compulsory aliveness aims to impose a will to live and makes some people's desire for death seem abnormal, inconceivable, and unintelligible, except for those cast as unproductive, undesirable, unsalvageable subject, such as disabled, sick, ill, and old people who are at the end of their life. In their case, their desire for death is considered normal and rebranded as medical assistance in dying. And it seems as rational. It seems like the right thing to do. However, from a sanist perspective, suicidal people's desire for death is cast as irrational, crazy, mad, insane, alienated, and they are stripped of their autonomy, agency, decision-making capacity, and the rights to consent to or to refuse healthcare in a curative process aimed to reintegrate them as normal and productive citizen into a neoliberal and capitalist economy. In fact, in many national legal contexts, a person is often forcibly institutionalized, physically restrained to a bed or involuntary drug because they are simultaneously suicidal or perceived as such. It therefore becomes really hard to distinguish between the systems of oppressions. Being suicidal itself is enough to be labeled as mad and crazy. Being mentally ill requires a medical or psychiatric cure, and forced treatments are seen as the norm when it comes to people who represent a danger to themselves. So, in other words, from an ableist, sanist, ageist, and capitalist perspectives, people who are seen as unsalvageable, unproductive, a burden, such as disabled, sick, ill, old people, are supported and even encouraged to die through assisted methods, as demonstrated by our laws. At the same time, suicidal people seen as salvageable and having a potential productive future are explicitly excluded from these laws and forced by being constrained to hospital beds to stay alive. And it's important to mention that in all national contexts that allow some form of assisted death, suicidal people are systematically excluded. Only people who are physically or sometimes mentally ill can have access to these procedures, and these laws specify that no suicidal person should ever be supported in their desire to die. So I see the creation of those two classes of suicidal subject, that is one that is allowed to die and the other one that is forced to live, as problematic. And in my work, I ask the following question. Why are we offering assistance in dying to disabled, sick, ill, and old people who, in the vast majority of cases, don't want to die, but ask for better living conditions and are driven to despair by the lack of help, while those who do want to die, such as suicidal people, are denied any assistance and forced to die alone in atrocious conditions or simply literally forced to stay alive? So in my work, I argue that this desire to cure suicidal people and save their lives at all costs is embedded in this compulsory aliveness and this injunction to live into futurity. And as a dominant system of intelligibility within a suicidist regime, compulsory aliveness masks its own historicity and mechanism of operation, which give life an apparently stable and natural character. Yet, this stability and this naturalness stem from performative statements about the desire to live. So, by modelizing Judith Butler's thesis on gender as performative, I see the desire to live as performative, that is, being socially constructed. Indeed, institutions, social policies, laws, practices, intervention, treatments, theories, and discourse shape the desire to live and present it in a similar way we present gender, as if it were a natural, stable, unchangeable desire, whereas it results from norms, discourses, pressures, and practice that remain invisible within a suicidist regime. But reversely, the desire to die is pathologized and seen as completely abnormal. So, in the spirit of Sarah Ahmed's suspension of the presumption that happiness is necessarily a good thing, I wonder what kind of new relationship to suicidality and suicidal people could emerge if we let go of the injunction to live into futurity and suspend our adherence to compulsory aliveness. As Ahmed does it in relation to happiness, I'm interested in tracking the effects of the presence of compulsory aliveness on marginalized groups, including suicidal people, because the injunction to live into futurity is often used to justify the oppression of the most marginalized groups. So, what does it mean in this context to not only have a happiness duty, but also a life duty, implemented through a vast array of mechanisms and carceral institutions in the name of cure and care? Ahmed believes that in a world so focused on happiness, unhappiness becomes in some ways a right. Similarly, in suicidist societies that impose life through various forms of violence, I argue that death by suicide should become a right and a positive one. So the difference between negative and positive rights is the following. Negative rights usually involve a liberty to do something without the interference of others or the state, while positive rights involve obligations toward others or the duty to assist the person. So the injunction to live into futurity underlies the preventionist script that is present in almost every discourse and strategy intervention on suicidality. In the various models of suicidality, and in my book, I review 4 of those models. So the medical model, the biopsychosocial model and public health model, the social model, and the social justice model, as well as in the view of right to die activists, suicidal people must be kept alive. So surprisingly, when it comes to suicidal people, everyone agrees that supporting their suicide is not an option. And in the few cases where suicide is not seen as a negative action to be absolutely avoided, suicide is presented as a negative right. That is a personal decision with which we should not interfere, but not as a positive right that should be supported by the state and society. And this is precisely what my work challenges. And bear with me, it will become more clear toward the end where I'm going with this, because my queercrip model of suicide in my queercrip model, suicide becomes a positive right. However, I want to make it clear that my approach is radically distinct from that of offering physician-assisted death for people for whom mental illness is the sole condition of their request. In fact, in my work, I advocate for the abolition of all these discriminatory laws on physician-assisted death that allow assisted suicide only for quote-unquote special populations based on dominant norms of who should live or die. And I would like to see the creation of complete new laws and policies surrounding assisted suicide for all adults who have a stable desire to die, including suicidal people. In other words, my approach is not based on a physical or mental illness or disability diagnosis as the criterion for allowing assisted suicide. I'm not saying, of course, that current discourses, policies, interventions, suicide prevention programs, or hotlines based on the suicidist preventionist scripts never help anyone. Neither am I condemning suicidal people who search for cures, be they medical or social. As a suicidal person myself since the age of 12, I know how we can be desperate and how sometimes we would take any cure that could help us. But I simply want to highlight how this suicidist curative logic cannot imagine anything other than prevention to help suicidal people. Suicidality needs to be eradicated completely. So my theoretical framework on suicidism unpacks this idea that the best way to help suicidal people is through the logic of prevention and cure. So in lieu of the curative and carceral logic underlying the preventionist script, as well as the ableist, sanist, ageist logic of disposability fundamental to various right to die discourses, I propose a queercrip model of assisted suicide that offers positive rights and support for assisted suicide for suicidal people. And this assistance would be offered and delivered through a suicide affirmative approach and suicide affirmative healthcare. I'll explain this in the rest of my presentation. I have about 10 more minutes. So my model, and it's important, aims to complement, not supersede, the fight against the systemic oppressions that influence suicidality in marginalized groups. This model puts forward the idea that fighting for social justice is not contradictory to greater accountability towards suicidal people. Both goals could be pursued simultaneously. Additionally, while the objective of my model is to provide more human, respectful, and compassionate support for suicidal people rather than saving lives at all costs, this is very important. One of my hypotheses is that a suicide affirmative approach that supports assisted suicide for suicidal people might in fact save more lives than current prevention strategies. And you might wonder why? Because simply, rather than being forced to die in secrecy and silence by completing their suicide without consulting anyone due to fear of experiencing suicidist consequences and violence, suicidal people in this model would finally have the chance to speak freely and to benefit for the first time from an accompaniment process to reach an informed decision about their desire to live or die. So my anti-suicidist and suicide affirmative approach is anchored in the values of anti-oppressive social movements such as intersectionality, bodily autonomy, self-determination, informed consent, and also harm reduction. Harm reduction approaches are used in a variety of contexts to support various marginalized communities. It's an attitude towards social issues guided by a bottom-up, compassionate, and pragmatic stance. So this attitude is not based on the logic of prohibition or abstinence. It's rather a humanistic, non-judgmental, and non-pathologizing attitude focused on empowering groups often living at the intersections of multiple oppressions. While Indigenous activists and scholars such as Lana Ray show that the harm reduction approach could be used from a mainstream perspective to further harm communities, it's also possible to mobilize a harm reduction approach in a way that pursues social justice for those communities from critical perspectives, such as queer and Indigenous perspectives. So as Ray says, and I quote here, for the Canadian Aboriginal AIDS Network and the Interagency Coalition on AIDS and Development, Harm reduction is understood as a way of life governed by love, non-judgment, and non-interference. Harm reduction is not about reducing harm related to bad choices, but instead is about supporting individuals to navigate life in ways that are available to them. So Ray reminds us that a queer and indigenous harm reduction approach would allows to politicize and address structural forms of violence which frames and constrains the choices made by individuals, but without invalidating self-determination and agency. Adopting a harm reduction approach implies recognizing the complexity inherent in providing help, support, and rights in relation to practices such as suicide that are not considered optimal or ideal. Following Enslas and Peltier, suicidality can be seen as, and here I use their term, a rational response to desperate living conditions. So in an ideal world, no one, of course, would ever want to die or self-harm because of oppressive systems. But we do not and might never live in this ideal world. Meanwhile, we need to find more effective solutions than waiting for the revolution to come. And it is from this pragmatic and perspective that I approach suicidality. Suicide and assisted suicide, of course, are not a panacea. And by offering a suicide affirmative approach, my hope is not to increase suicidality, but rather to better support and accompany suicidal people here and now. So attempting to destigmatize assisted suicide and have it recognized as one viable option among many others may paradoxically help suicidal people find solutions other than suicide on their exploratory journey. And simultaneously, a harm reduction approach may allow a small number of suicidal people who are determined to die to be accompanied while preparing for and completing for their deaths. But either way, my suicide affirmative approach insists on building relationships with suicidal people and on caring for and supporting them throughout their journey. My anti-suicidist and suicide affirmative approach is also inspired by trans affirmative approaches for trans people. A suicide affirmative approach does not mean pushing suicidal people to suicide. As you know, the goal of the trans affirmative approach is not to push a person to transition. Rather, it means that instead of trying to cure trans people of their transness or suicidal people of their suicidality, we develop safer spaces in which we can examine their suicidality with them and discuss a wide variety of options. So my approach proposes to shift from a preventionist and curative logic to a logic of accompaniment for suicidal people, a form of support that could be both life-affirming and death-affirming. And this shift from prevention to accompaniment empowers suicidal people and offers them greater epistemic justice. Indeed, from a preventionist stance, other people, such as family, researchers, healthcare providers, hold the truth on suicide. Suicide needs to be prevented, the suicidal person should not be given a choice, and the various interventions aimed to implement choices made by others are imposed on the suicidal person, often without their consent. So from the preventionist point of view, and this is important, life rather than the suicidal person and what they claim, what they feel is the priority. So the epistemic authority of the suicidal person is denied when it comes to matters of life and death. But in the anti-suicidist logic of accompaniment I propose, the epistemic authority switches hands. The suicidal person has epistemic authority, and those around them are there to offer support. In other words, while from a suicidist preventionist script, there is a pre-identified goal and solution, saving lives, designed by non-suicidal people, my logic of accompaniment centers on the suicidal person to help them identify their own goals and solutions. And this is very important. The priority here is the suicidal person, not life itself. So I will conclude uh, I will conclude with that. While the right to die by assisted suicide is almost always cast by anti-oppression activists and scholars as one of the most conservative or violent positions someone can endorse, the anti-suicidist and suicide affirmative approach shows that supporting a renewed and radical form of assisted suicide does not go hand in hand with political conservatism and austerity thinking. In sum, my anti-suicidist approach based on harm reduction proposes an ethics of living with suicidal people while they are making their ultimate decision about life and death. So thank you very much. I look forward to discuss with you. I will stop sharing here.
Merci beaucoup, Alexandre. C'est incroyable. Hello and bonjour à tous, those of you who have joined as well following the beginning of this webinar. I have so many good feelings and just genuine appreciation for your work. And I know there'll be a number of questions. If you can, please use the Q&A box. Just even if you don't want to write your question out there, just write your name in there so that I have a log of who to go in order. But before we get to the questions, I just want to say a couple reflections back from this, Alexandre, which is that I think your conversation about harm reduction is so timely, and I'm struck by the parallels between the current, really, in many ways, what's happening across North America, but particularly here in Canada and places like Alberta and British Columbia and Ontario, with this sort of reactionary response to harm reduction as it relates to um, drugs and substance-related poisoning and death. That there is this kind of a reaction to decades of documentation of the efficacy of harm reduction approaches, now with very with approaches that are highly punitive, highly carceral in nature, and that really diminish not only the positive rights of people to any number of experiences, but really that steal the language of healthcare and recovery into something that is profoundly violent. And so I think there's some really interesting space to begin thinking coalitionally around, in many ways, extending what you're doing here around suicidism, to look at really the kind of politicization of harm reduction in Canada and elsewhere in the world today in the midst of these sort of popular rightist movements. I was also thinking how gatherings like this, and certainly the Suicide Justice series has been a space of this, is that and an audience as large as today, people are coming very much from the position of alignment with the provocations you're offering, for many probably disalignment or being new to, and then also for many of us, myself included, as a registered health professional, deeply implicated in the socio-legal frameworks and complicit in the socio-legal frameworks that um, yeah, I think complicate the movement between the theoretical argument being presented and what it means to practice legally and ethically as providers in varying contexts. And um, be that as it may, I think your work brings a really exciting invitation for us to think about the efficacy of accompaniment, the ethical responsibilities of accompaniment, and also what it might mean in these times, just like in times of the development of harm reduction strategies for people who use drugs, to be principally transgressive. So I just deeply appreciate your offering to us today. As people offer your questions, I'm going to begin to take them in sequence. And as just a reminder, in a room as large as this, as Alexander's already named, we are navigating questions of living and dying ourselves. And so, as you ask your questions and engage with conversations, there'll be a high threshold and degree of trust as folks use language discerningly. And I will be stopping the recording at this point as well to protect the anonymity of those who engage in conversation at this juncture. So I'll do that now.